Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to a town hall with Councilmembers Jim Oddie and Malia Vella. I'm Sarah Henry, the city's Public Information Officer, and I'll help moderate today's event. Please note all participants have been muted. To submit a question, please use the chat feature. Following remarks by our speakers, they'll be available to answer your questions. I'd now like to turn today's town hall over to Alameda Councilmembers Jim Oddie and Malia Vella to introduce our special guests.
Thank you, Sarah. And I think before we turn it over to our guests, I think both Councilmember Vella and I wanted to make a couple brief remarks. First of all, for those who aren't familiar, since the COVID crisis, all of our colleagues, ourselves included, have been using Zoom as kind of a tool to inform our constituents and our residents and hear their feedback on issues that are important to them. And, you know, we've talked about rents and businesses and testing and mental health, and in the public eye, obviously, our police relations, the whole racial relations in the entire country. So we wanted to take a few minutes today and chat with a couple of people about an idea that we've heard, and that's of independent police commission. So before we get into that, I just want to step back and kind of look at it from a global perspective. And first of all, I'll say that I think our entire council, down to the 5 of us, I don't want to speak for them, but you know, knowing them as I do and knowing the values that I've seen them from working with them for all of this time, I think we're all committed to listening to our constituents, to implementing change here in Alameda and making sure that Alameda is a place where everybody can feel safe. So, but I wanted to step back just a little bit. I don't know if anyone heard the remarks by the coach of the Spurs, and I know this is a Warriors town, so, but I think it's important to listen to him, you know, especially when he talks about the struggle for civil rights, and, you know, basically the white person's kind of standing on the sidelines for that. And I think it's a point well taken that if you go back and look through our history, you can go back to the Civil War, and, you know, Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman, you know, they were the ones, you know, working on abolition and the Underground Railroad. And you go back to the, you know, 50s and 60s, and there were, you know, names like Rosa Parks and, you know, John Lewis and Martin Luther King Jr. I mean, sure, they had some white allies, but, you know, let's put our fragility aside for a minute and you know, focus on who the real heavy lifters were in this movement, you know. And you go to the 70s and you know, the struggle to have the pride flag flown in front of our city hall, you know, that was from the Stonewall bar in New York. And, you know, the rights that, you know, Cesar Chavez and Lara Huerta and Philip Veracruz and Larry Itliong fought for. So my point is that, you know, these struggles for equality and for justice and for civil rights, the burden for so long in my mind has fallen on people of color. And I think now it's time for, you know, people that look like me to kind of play a bigger role and stand up and do more. I don't think we've been doing enough. You know, if there's any positive from what's going on in the country now and in the last 4 years, and, you know, maybe the last 50 or 400, is that, you know, there's more, we are more woke. So I want to encourage people to be more woke, and especially people that look like me, that, you know, it's time for us to stand up and support our brothers and sisters that have been fighting this fight for many, many years. So before we get into the issue of independent police commission, I just want to, you know, I think we also, as Alamedans, and, you know, us as, I'll speak for me as a council member, you know, we have to take some responsibility for where we are today. I mean, we have the police force that we asked for. There was somebody on Facebook I saw, and I personally think she's like one of the most woke persons I know, said, you know, rethought that, you know, we have neighborhood watch where, you know, neighbors basically are told to report everything to the police. So that's something that over the course of many, many years, Alamedans have asked for, and our city leaders have basically demanded of the police department. And so let's take a look at, you know, we have to take a look at that. And, you know, is our police department doing what we want them to do? I mean, do they need to be going out on, you know, welfare check calls? Do they need to be responsible for the animal shelter? You know, we get, Malia can attest to this, you know, we get emails from constituents demanding that the police clear homeless encampments. Well, last I checked, being homeless was not a crime. You know, we get calls for people complaining about, maybe a Latino neighbor that plays their music too loud, saying you need to cite them because they're missing a front license plate. I mean, we get calls and complaints that, there's a Chinese woman rummaging through my garbage. So, I mean, I think we all need to take a look at, what it is that we want from a police force. And when we talk about safety, what it is that we want for safety. And, I think the word public has to be included in public safety. So last week we had Zach Norris. So if you haven't read his book or bought it, check it out. I'm going to finish it, and then it's available for anyone who wants to borrow it. And the last few items I just want to point out, a lot of times people will hear what's been said in Alameda and basically say, well, that person lied to me. That video was not the way it was portrayed to be. So, I mean, if there was a case, I think, in the Fourth Circuit just recently, and there was a quote I want to say from it. It says, although we recognize that our police officers are often asked to make split-second decisions, we expect them to do so with respect for the dignity and the worth of Black lives. So let's chunk that into two pieces. I mean, the first one requires a lot of skill and a lot of training and skill that I don't have. We're physical, mental, psychological. So we're asking that of people, and we train them to do that. So what I think we need to do more of is take that second part of that quote and work on training and focus on that, because if we can train our police officers to do the first thing, make split-second decisions, we can also train them to do the second half. And that's where we get to this particular topic, because there's a question about, well, if somebody makes a mistake, what's the accountability? That we have a charter in Alameda. You can agree with it, you can disagree with it. This is not the forum to really talk about that, but that charter does not really give the council a lot of say in the accountability of different officers of the city, just the three people that report directly to us. And one idea that has been floated around recently here in town is of an independent police commission. So we decided, Malia and I, we wanted to have a discussion about that, learn what it is, the pitfalls, where it works, where it doesn't work, where it can go wrong, where it can do right. Not that we want to go ahead and do this, but I think we owe it to you as your council members to evaluate these different options and research them, and do our homework. So that's why we have our two guests today. And this is an idea. I know it came before us a couple years ago, and I thought it was a bad idea because I thought it was motivated by retaliation by the former mayor for her husband getting pulled over by the police for a crime, driving under the influence. So I don't think we have that situation today in this discussion, but that's why I didn't really think there was much value in that discussion a few years back. So I'm going to turn it over to Malia. She'll make some comments, then I'll introduce our speakers.
I want to thank our speakers for joining us today. I think, I want to put out there that I really value your experience and insight in the work that you've done. I think both Berkeley and Oakland have, in many ways, led the way on this, and I'm hoping that we can learn from you about what that process has been like, and the issues that you're still working through. Because I think, just as anything, once you can get something kicked off, there's going to be more things that you learn as you go. So I'm really interested in hearing about that. And I think, just to put everything in perspective, at least here for the context of what's going on in Alameda, on May 23rd, one of our residents was pulled over. Molly Watkins was pulled over, not pulled over, but literally driven up on. Somebody called it in to report to the non-emergency line. That then got dispatched. Officers then showed up. He was outside of his house dancing, and things escalated. And it wasn't just one officer, there were two officers. That one came up behind him. More officers then arrived, and what should have been a very brief interaction, if any, became national news, as it should be, because I think when we all look at this as you know, just normal citizens from a non-law enforcement perspective, I think we often think, was that use of force necessary? Was that stop or that interaction necessary? And I you know, having worked with DAs, worked on the criminal prosecution side, you know, often what the people think the standard should be and what the legal standard is can often be different. And so for me, I really want this, part of this conversation, I think, has become not only how do we want to reimagine policing, how do we want to reimagine what our department could be, and the services that we could and should provide, by looking at what sort of things do we currently dispatch police to respond to. But I also think we need to look at what our dispatching policies are. How do we intake those calls? How are we processing that? And then have a conversation also about what work do we need to do from a societal level, that this somebody dancing in front of their house becomes some sort of reportable thing, where we're calling for aid. Why do you feel that way? Why do we think that that's the appropriate response? And I think that there's a lot of work that we need to do as a community, as a council. It's not just holding folks accountable, I would hope, for this one incident, because I know that there are others. There are other incidents that I've called up and asked about, even from this past year, that were concerning to me. And I, you know, I think this is about how do we create a department that we can be proud of and that we can stand by, from the policies to the people to the services that we provide. This is about public service, and so we have to talk about that. And then how do we hold ourselves accountable? And you know, some people have asked, well, how do we do that? And accountability, and I think what we're going to hear from both John and George, is accountability is an ongoing process. It doesn't stop with changing policies. You have to actively then enforce those policies. You have to find a way to make sure that the community is heard and has a say in this, and that it's a diverse representation that goes into actively ensuring that the department is doing what it's intended to do. And so I've been really pleased with the number of people in Alameda who have become much more vocal and active on Black Lives Matter and police accountability. And I think this is, you know, going to give us an opportunity to improve what our services are, and really make Alameda a place that everyone, we have the saying, everyone belongs here, and we need to do more than just say that. We really need to make sure that people feel that way. And certainly what was portrayed in the videos that have gone out, in the footage, it does not show or reflect that ethos, and so we need to do something about it. So with that, I would like to turn it back to Jim, Councilmember Oddie, to introduce our speakers. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Malia. As I think I mentioned earlier, you know, the idea of a citizens police commission or police review board or that type of thing is an idea that's floating around. And, you know, I'm here today, and I invited our speakers, or we invited our speakers here today to kind of learn more about it, so the community can learn more about it and you know, hear the pros and the cons and the good and the bad. So two speakers. One is George Perez Velez. George is from Berkeley. I think he serves on the Berkeley Police Commission. I've gotten to know George the last few years, working together in one of our county local parties, and doing good work. He's an amazing guy, and I'm glad that he was able to take some time to share some of his experiences. And our other guest is John Jones from Oakland. I've known John maybe 6 years. First time I met him, was at a press conference when we were talking about the fight for 15. And John talked about, I think, when he was working when he was younger with a minimum wage job, and he got a pay increase. And the first thing he did with that extra pay was buy curtains for his bedroom. And that, I'm not going to tear up now, man. I mean, that has stayed with me, since the moment I heard it. And, it just reminds me that, when we help out and increase the pay of, the lowest wage workers, we're all going to benefit, because they're just going to, improve our economy. So, and John has been a longtime activist in Alameda, and I'm proud to call him my friend. And he was one of the people that helped, I believe, interview and staff up Oakland's first police commission, which was just adopted by the voters a few years back. So I'm going to turn it over to them. You guys can flip a coin who goes first, but we're going to sit back and listen. And then when you're done presenting, Sarah's going to ask some questions from our audience.
Go ahead, John.
I'm going to say, actually, George, if you don't mind going first, that way I can make sure my son is settled, my 5-year-old.
That's fine then. So, Tim and Malia, thank you for giving me this opportunity to talk to your community. In addition to Berkeley, I'm also the founding member of the BART Police Oversight Board. So I've been in 2 police oversight agencies in the Bay Area for the last 13 to almost 15. But my work started in Boston and in Atlanta, Georgia, defending the rights to protest and march and demonstrate for unions and people of color. So I have a long history of having to interact with the police from across the line and being able to see what the use of force policies and how they interact with the public. I mean, as both of you were talking, I was writing some notes, and you talked about training. And you always have to ask a question: what is it? What does it look like, and what it is intended to accomplish? The police might have a right to be able to hold law and order in a city, but the community has a right to say how they want to be policed, and that is extremely important. We talked about accountability and transparency. Offer service in the city, and taxpayers and the community is counting on the services. You have to be accountable to the people that are paying your salaries and the people that live within your community. That conversation is important. Transparency is important because you have to figure it out. What is it that your community needs? What is the kind of conversations and views into your operation as a city and as an organization that they need to be able to have to be able to pinpoint what they think needs to be changed. I mean, I looked at the video, and the thing I said this to Oddie was, whatever happened to courtesy, whatever happened to de-escalation, whatever happened to asking things first. It always looks to me when something escalates from 0 to nothing, when the person on the other side, who is not a law enforcement person, finds himself in a situation in which they have to be the end result of the interaction, is what kind of marginalization are we doing here? What kind of biases did the police officers walk into when they saw him? Or what kind of information was given to them by the police dispatcher, which created bias interpretation of what they were walking into? So now always trying to figure out what is the interaction within a police officer when they get out of that car, and what's that they're seeing? Is the interaction different with a white young man or a white woman or an African American or a Latino? Is the conversation different if it's somebody who looks obviously to be a transgender person, right? What are the interactions that are making those bias policing triggers into that person affect how they interact with the public? And from there on, everything just either can escalate or de-escalate. It was started as a police oversight based on the end result of demonstrations for free speech. It was a voter ordinance, so the voters voted to implement that. But then BART was created by Ashland's legislature because of the killing and the death of Oscar Grant. So when people say to me, why do we need isn't that overreach? I always say it takes one police officer one time. It takes only one incident to create the catalyst for change. But do we have to wait for that catalyst in order for us to have change? So oversight is always about being proactive, not being reactive. It should not take the abuse of the First Amendment right to demonstrate to create an oversight agency. It shouldn't take the death of a young Black man on the platform of BART for us to create change. So when people ask me, why should we have a police oversight agency? Why should we engage in this process? I say, because the process is worth it. Because whether it's training, whether it is the ability for the community to have input on how the officers are trained, what are their perspectives, what is it that you are trying to accomplish with having this huge organization that costs you a lot of money every day, and how do you want the community to be served? It is better to do it on the front than have to do it reactive in the back, when then you're trying to fix a problem that might not have existed if you just had the wherewithal to look into it and figure it out where things can be fixed. But I can talk a long time about this, but I am happy that I am here I was born and raised in Puerto Rico, so I came to the United States. So as a person of color who obviously has an accent, we always find ourselves in situations with the police in which there's fear and there's trepidation and there's this innate feeling, am I going to be okay? Am I going to go to jail? Am I going to say the wrong thing? So, but if the police officers are trained the right way and understand the needs of the community and have respect for the sanctity of life and the sanctity of the person that they're interacting with, I think we can go a long way. But that takes training, oversight, community input, and diligence.
Thank you, George. That was amazing input, and I'm honored to be here. Seriously, I want to thank both Malia and Jim for this opportunity, and I really want to thank the amazing residents of Alameda. I think, for me, I always have a saying, transformation can only occur from close proximity. And for me, policing in America is really essentially a matter of perception and proximity. You know, how we perceive people and situations really predicated on our proximity to them. If there are people who are familiar, and by familiar, just being honest, if they look like us, if they walk like us, if they dress like us. And the same in the obverse is true. There's a tendency to be more suspicious of people who we're not in proximity to. I am a member of the Coalition for Police Accountability, and we were one of the major driving forces and groups that pushed for the passage of Measure LL in the city of Oakland in 2016, which created the Civilian-Led Police Commission. I was appointed as the inaugural member of the selection panel. There are 7 police commissioners and 2 alternates. The selection panel chooses 4 of the police commissioners and 1 of the alternates, all subject to the approval of council. I had the honor of serving as both vice chair and as chair. And one of the things I fought for initially was to ensure that under the measure, the selection panel was tasked with conducting background checks. I wanted to make sure that we did not add criminal background checks. And I want to share this for a reason. More often than not, there's clearly an intersection between having a criminal record and police brutality. More often than not, if there is an article written, usually at the bottom for someone, an unarmed person who's murdered by the police, it would say this person served time in prison. That information actually got out after George Floyd was murdered. There was an officer in Minnesota who said, oh, this is a violent criminal. I have personal experience with that as someone who has a serious violent conviction from my youth, being arrested at 16 and tried as an adult. And when an officer runs my record, what it does not show is my culpability in that act. It just shows a conviction, which was a result of a plea bargain. And being a minor and a teenager, I had no understanding of the law, let alone the long-term consequences. So people are treated differently, as I say, as it relates to perception and proximity. The incident in Alameda, and this may come as a shock to many folks in Alameda, when I seen that video, I was not shocked nor surprised. As a kid born and raised in East Oakland, I've been to Alameda many a times. And I can share with you, I have also experiences in the city of Alameda as it relates to police, to the point to where I didn't want to drive in Alameda no more, because every time I drive through Alameda, I get pulled over. And it's usually the same thing. The first thing that officers tell someone that looks like me, the question is, are you on probation or parole? That's what I mean by perception. That's the first lean to. Am I on paper? Meaning, am I a criminal? And then the next thing we're told is, oh, you ran that stop sign. I'm like, that was a four-way stop sign, buddy, and I seen you. I wanted you to go first because I didn't want you behind me. So these things are real, and we have to understand that there are a couple layers and levels to policing. Usually people focus just on the police officers themselves. The truth is, it's much more deeper and complex than that. As we've seen with that video, it becomes a matter of people in the community who, some people, just to be real, from my perspective, utilize the police as a weapon. We witnessed that in the city of Oakland with the incident with the woman that has been infamously dubbed Barbecue Becky. That was a civil matter, whether or not Kenzie, someone I know, was barbecuing using coals. We have to understand that policing is not just a profession. It is a community resource, and how these resources are used and how they are not used. People have to also understand that in addition to the impact, the human toll, there is a real fiscal and budgetary aspect as well. Just as an example, in Oakland recently, there was a resident who was harmed severely by a police officer, and the officer accused this person who was on a motorcycle of running a red light. Due to all the cameras that was in that area, we know that, in fact, it was the police officer who ran the red light. And as a result, this individual received a settlement from the city of Oakland in the amount of $12 million. I want to be clear, I am not averse to people being compensated for the harm that they have experienced, but we are also in the midst of a crippling housing crisis. This is money that could have been used and allocated toward ending this crisis that we're experiencing, which is just not in Oakland. So for that reason, I think it's very important when we talk about policing that we don't label this as a Black problem or a Black issue. This is extremely problematic to me for two key reasons. First of all, anytime something is labeled as Black, we know this when we go to our educational institutions. Black studies, what happens? That's just for Black people. No, this is a human issue. And as members of a shared beloved community, we are all inherently, as part of that social contract, tasked with ending this. When we elevate it from a Black problem and being very clear, we do understand that Black people disproportionately experience this. No one is invisibilizing that. But more often than not, to the point that Jim made in the opening, there are folks who, many white people who I know mean well, they're well-intentioned, really don't know how to plug in because the way it's framed. We all must be involved in ending this. I want us to also think in this terms when we talk about policing. All of us who have a job understands accountability. There are rules and regulations, something that we're taught as young as 5 years old. In fact, I believe that's why we go to kindergarten, to become socialized, to learn how to get along well with others. And we're given a report card, and the basis of the report card is to measure and monitor where we stand in relation to being socialized. Sometimes for me, I struggle with the term implicit bias because it seems like it provides a cover. For me, we have to be very explicit in what's happening. This is not implicit. This is not a matter of, oh, I, as an officer, am unaware that I have this bias against people of color. No, we're all grown, right? No police officer joined the force at 12 years old. And there is ample evidence that backs this up. So how do we get to accountability? First of all, it's important to start there. We have to have a process. And one of the reasons why I appreciate Alameda having this conversation and even thinking about this, in terms of some of the mistakes Oakland made, keep in mind that Oakland has a long history of police brutality. I think some people forget that the Black Panther Party for self-defense was formed in response to police brutality that was happening then in the 1960s. I think the difference today is with the advent of social media and the ability to have phones with cameras, we're hearing more and more incidents. So it appears that it's happening more frequently. I'm here to suggest and submit to you all that this is not a new phenomenon. Growing up in East Oakland, I was 12 years old when I was slammed against a wall by an OPD officer and called the N-word. Two of my childhood friends, Jermaine Adams was shot in the back of the head, running from police. They said he had a gun. What he had in a brown bag was beer. People might say, well, why was he running from law enforcement? This is perception and proximity. When police officers come in our community, we're already criminalized, and we were being beat then. Someone had asked me when I shared the incident that happened when I was 12, they asked me why I didn't report that to the police? How do you report harm to your abuser? We didn't even have a mechanism in place, let alone a sense of faith and trust from the community with the same people who are tasked and paid by taxpayer dollars to keep us safe. So I think for Alameda, a lesson learned from Oakland is to not wait until something horrible and egregious happened. Because keep in mind, Oakland was under federal oversight since 2003. Mm-hmm. And the precursor, strange enough, to Measure L passed it, and the reason why it received 83% of the vote was the egregious actions that involved what has been labeled as a sex scandal. Let me be clear, that was not a sex scandal. A sex scandal is when a person cheats on their spouse. A minor cannot consent legally to sex. That was rape. Under the shield, under the protection of the shield, and using that shield to convey and share information about criminal investigations, and how the city of Oakland specifically and intentionally sought to bury that egregious act. And sad enough, it really took a note from an officer, a suicide note, for that to blow open. So Alameda has an opportunity to not have that proverbial egg on their face. Because mind you, when this was happening, I was in the city of Detroit, and I turned on a show on Comedy Central, and they had a skit making fun of the number of police officers who were hired and fired within a week. So this is a matter of civic pride. And when I define the word community, I define it as common unity. What do we as shared members of this community, what do we have in common? What can we unify on? I think there are some things that's really key and clear. It has nothing to do with your race, your gender, your orientation, your religious or political affiliations. The desire to be housed, right? The ability to provide, to have a roof over your head and put food on the table, to make sure your loved ones are taken care of. And above all, as Jim said, safety, public safety. The word public means all of us, not just some of us. And something I want to add that relates to this is, in terms of viewing the police as a resource and how police are utilized. In that video in Alameda, for someone to call the police because they see a Black man dancing, I don't want to go down a rabbit hole on that one, but that to me just speaks volume. When I think of things like mental health, someone dancing in the street, that's a joyous thing. How is that viewed as harmful, threatening, criminal, law-breaking? Right? Let's be real on this. It's not the dancing that was the problem. Because I'm quite sure if that person looked like was the same race of the caller, it would have been a whole different reaction. We in the 21st century have to get to a place, especially here in the Bay Area. We have to reconcile.
Did we lose John?
It looks like it.
Is he frozen?
Maybe George, you could kind of
Yeah, I'll touch base in what he said. I mean, it's he was talking about implicit versus explicit. The whole conversation is whether we internally as human beings have biases and how those biases are not addressed when we confront people that are different than us. So we forget about the commonality of who we are as a community and start judging people for what our wrong perceptions are. The trigger is when that implicit or very down a bias becomes explicit, and becomes explicit in the actions of a police officer and what the end result of that is. I mean, it is true that the conversation has gone around about, is it really necessary for police officers to have to answer to mental health or welfare calls, and whether if there isn't an association with someone who is part of the mental health organization, and if there's no CIT training in a police department, then there always is a rush to judgment that that person might be aggressive because that person might just be under distress. So I don't understand. I mean, to me, after seeing, and John is back, after seeing that video, I would have to agree with John. I mean, it's not a question of what the interpretation was. I mean, if it would have been somebody else, how would have being seen. Even from a religious aspect, you know, leaping and dancing in front of the Lord is not a sin. I mean, but the interpretation of there's someone who is doing something that looks different than me, and I feel threatened. Therefore, I'm going to use the police as a use of force sword, so to speak, to inflict fear on this person so that I can no longer feel uncomfortable about this behavior. And I'm going to minimize that person's right to behave in any manner that he or she wants. It becomes part of the conversation. I mean, it's, would have I taken anything to ask the person, hey, why are you dancing? Are you happy? What's going on? That commonality of human decency is gone out of the equation as well. And when we don't have that, you know, we define each other in a manner which is not positive. So I loved your words, John. They are right on point, sir. But I think John is back too. I think
he may have frozen again.
It's frozen again. I mean, I was part of the community when we were trying to sell the measure to pass in Oakland. They went to a lot of different Democratic clubs and different organizations to try to figure it out what people were feeling, what were people's attitude about it. So I would recommend that the city council, apart from this great community forum, have more interactions with the community about what is it that they're looking for in the police department. And you'll find that in those conversations, you'll find instances in which a police officer has behaved badly, has behaved poorly, and has not engaged the community in a manner in which the community wants to be engaged. And that will give you a foothold of what it is that the community needs and deserves. But I am obviously, I'm a proponent of police oversight. I'm a proponent of having to have the police officer sit across a community member and answer the question. Answer the question, talk to me about your training, talk to me about your behavior, talk to me on how you interact with the public. That is extremely valuable. Having a process by which someone in the community can say, I was an object of police brutality or police discourtesy or improper arrest and seizure, or as John said, you know, the first question that I was asked when I was stopped was, do you have a warrant for your arrest? Was I marginalized as a person of color because the first question that you asked me was, am I a criminal? Instead of asking me the question, did you know that was a four-way stop and that it was your right to pass? So I'm stopping you because I just want to have a conversation with you. That was not the first interaction with the person. And I can tell you that I have sat in maybe 150 disciplinary boards and 150 boards of inquiry in which there are allegations against police officers. And having the opportunity to present your case as a member of the community, having the opportunity to ask questions from that officer based on the training that they have, and then seeing whether the training is accurate and it is the right thing for the community, it's invaluable. So I think that police oversight works because it's a tool for the community to present not necessarily their grievances all the time, but to really to define their communities and what they expect for their services.
So I know I could probably go on and have this conversation, but I don't want to talk, I want to listen. So if John is back, maybe we let him finish up and then let's open it up to questions, if that's okay.
Oh, yeah, sure. Yes, I'm back. Thank you, Jim. Let's try this again. Internet issues. This is interesting. Okay, here we go. Okay, everyone can hear me? Okay, always compare, it's interesting on the point of internet issues, right? Because we in the Bay Area, the home of Silicon Valley, and the fact that people are experiencing internet issues it's interesting, right? But I think the parallel as it relates to police brutality is the same concept, because once again, we are a region renowned for being liberal and progressive. So to think that we will experience these issues here, the same thing holds true. And as a side note, I was about to get somewhere. I was about to give y'all something juicy. They didn't want me to give it to you, but I'm back. I want to wrap up on this note, 2 points as it relates to the importance of accountability. I want to go back again. There's a saying I share often. Transformation can only occur from close proximity. And we need a process, a transparent process that brings both community and law enforcement together in a manner that not only provides accountability, but really instills a sense of confidence and trust. Why is that important? I'm someone born and raised in East Oakland where the mere idea of even having a conversation with an officer is taboo. You know, due to my own experiences, I mean, it took me a long time to even get to a place where I was even willing to sit in a room with a police officer. But what happens when both groups come together and have a conversation? What happens when the officer is able to hear and see through my lens what it's like interacting with police officers? And the transformation that happened on my end in terms of understanding that for the most part, a lot of officers are human beings. And I know like this issue is very touchy. I understand that, but I also understand the importance of integrity. So I speak my truth through that lens. I know some good officers on the police force. I know a lot of people would not want to say that and probably wouldn't want me to say that, but this becomes a matter of proximity. And when we are able to understand what some situations look like, we're closer to being able to build and maintain and sustain a process that's going to help end these horrific events that we're seeing. Because I can assure you, absent of that, there is nothing in place to disrupt it. Because I always say systems, and this is true of people in general, do not change, let alone reform on their own. In fact, someone shared with me, 2 things make a person change: inspiration or desperation. The second thing is this: community in general. We have to fully understand and reconcile our various and often conflicting ideas as it relates to policing. And that's going to require us to get uncomfortable. Because at the end of the day, when we talk about privilege, it's a privilege to feel comfortable. And as human beings, we're geared to remain in a state and place of comfort. And I want to go further when I say privilege, because usually it's defined as white privilege or male privilege. Let me be clear. Every demographic has a form of privilege. And for me, it don't have to always be the negative perspective of privilege. How do we use the positive aspects? And just a quick example for me, the privilege I have is as someone born and raised in East Oakland, I can go anywhere in the quote unquote hood and I don't feel the same anxiety or fear or trepidation other people don't. What I feel is home and peace. How do we build bridges instead of erecting walls? The importance of, once again, creating a civilian-led police commission also help instill trust in lawmakers and decision makers, because there are moving parts and circles to this. Just earlier today, I shared through social media that there were a number of rulings by the U.S. Supreme Court, which essentially stated police have no duty whatsoever to protect us. It sounds weird, don't it? We think of police serve and protect. There's been many cases where people tried to sue, and the Supreme Court consistently ruled police are under no obligation to protect us. Where does that leave us? I always feel at the end of the day, there's a tendency to simplify.
I think we lost John again.
Okay, well, how about we go to questions, and then George, hopefully you can tackle them, and John can wrap up his, I think he was just about to make the best point, but we'll have to wait for that.
Sure. Jim, the first question was for when you were talking about Zach's book. This person was referencing the book, saying that the book gives, the book gives discretion to act or not? They're asking which is correct.
Well, I didn't get that far yet, but it talked about just the idea of safety, and we focused, I think John kind of recapped it, you know, there's a focus on safety, and maybe the focus has to be on public safety. I promised to finish it before next Wednesday, but I don't have an answer because I haven't finished it yet.
And then the next question is, how much of the city budget goes towards policing and incarceration? This person knows that we don't have a jail in the city anymore, but thinks that maybe we lease spots. And then they ask, what is the opportunity to move that money into things that'll keep us safe, the way that Zach's book recommends?
This question comes up fairly, almost, I feel like every year when we do our budget, or at least around public safety. And we have a number of different funds that we pull money from to fund different programming. But in terms of the general fund, policing isn't it about 40%, Jim?
Something like that, right?
Yeah, and I think it's between, typically it's right around 40%, maybe 35% of the general fund goes into our police budget. I think a couple of things that have been discussed over the years have been how many vacancies we have. So how many allocated positions, how many vacancies. A question I asked last week of the city manager was, previously we had funded 2 SROs, 2 school resource officers. And are those positions that we should continue to fund? We know we have a huge need for mental health services in our schools. Should we be transitioning to somehow finding a way to continuously fund either school counselors or some sort of mental health professionals, that whether they're based at a school or just available for our constituents, something like that. So I think a lot of this is going to be about, at least from my perspective, there's 2 types of things that are funded out of the budget. There's, different sort of equipment or capital costs, so one-time expenditures, and then there's the personnel costs. And I think we have to look at both. And certain big capital costs or equipment costs that have been fairly recent have been fixed license plate readers. Which I know Councilmember Oddie joined me in opposing that. It was going to be a huge expenditure. There's a question about the ongoing contract with a group that was giving information to ICE. But I think we need to be very diligent about going through that budget and going back to the question, which I think both of our speakers touched upon, which is what are our community's expectations in terms of the services that we're providing? What does our community want to see in terms of what is carried out by an armed officer with somebody with a gun and a badge versus should we be looking at other types of personnel? And I have a question for George, which is, I know the city of Berkeley funds some mental health professionals to actually go out and handle mental health calls. And that's something that I think has been, the city of Berkeley has been very pioneering on, and a lot of that came as a result of some feedback from the Oversight Commission. So I know we have other questions, but I'd like to hear from George about that. So I think, I think we're all looking at, we've been looking at these budgets. We're in the midst of our mid-cycle budget talks. And I think there are going to be places that we could look to see if we can change who might be responding, how we respond. I think in many ways, and one of Zach's points is we have officers being the catch-all. Everyone picks up the phone, they dial 911, and then we send a police officer. And that's for somebody in crisis, somebody having, potentially being under the influence of drugs, that's in domestic violence situations, that's in, for burglaries and robberies. And so policing has kind of expanded into this catch-all, and there's no way we can train one person to be experts in all of those things. And so we need to really have that conversation. So I hope that our community can really inform the budget conversation in terms of how we spend our dollars. That's my position.
Thank you, Malia. I can tell you that, there are components to this. The city of Berkeley does fund a mental health crisis intervention team. Unfortunately, it is only funded between the hours of 9 o'clock in the morning and 10 o'clock at night. We haven't had the resources or the ability to do so after 10 p.m. at night. And if you were to think about it, when somebody might be in a distress, whether it's drug abuse, drug use, maybe there is some kind of altercation in a homeless encampment, or people that are unhoused, or whether it is someone who's having a distressful situation at their home. I mean, there's not always the ability to have that mental health specialist to be there to inform the decision-making process and to interact with the police department. So the other two aspects of that is not only implement, but obligate the department to have 100% of all its officers to be trained on CIT training. And the city of Berkeley is at 100%. BART is at 85%. So every single officer from rank all the way down is trained on crisis and intervention training. What that does is, and there's different levels, right? There is the 8 hours, 12 hours, 24 hours, two weeks training. It creates layers and levels of having to understand when you walk in interaction with that, what should be the first response. On top of that, then you really have to have a real robust review of the escalation and the use of force policy. And if you don't have a police oversight board, or if the council does not have, as a decision-making process, the ability to look into every single general order by which the police department operates under, know what kind of de-escalation techniques are obligatory or trained at the use of force policy, or we're doing crowd control and crowd management, or when dealing with folks who are on distress, or a general order, particularly with treatment of homeless individuals or transgender individuals. And because you don't have that, you're not able to see whether CIT training is implemented to every single police officer, where the escalation techniques are a priority for the police department and how they interact with individuals, and whether the mental health crisis, it's a good supplement or should be the only alternative. Having said that, the other aspect of training here, to go to the conversation that we have because of the video, is what's the training that is being done to the folks that are answering the 911 calls? Because that's a trigger. That first interaction of the questions that are asked for individuals that are calling are transmitted to the police officer through a dispatch. So that information is quite relevant. We don't know what information, how it is cataloged, how it is assigned on the system, in the CAT system. So the police officers are going into respond to a call, and they're walking in thinking whatever information they're given. So their expectations of what the interaction will be, it's already biased. So we don't know, is it a mental health call, the distress.
Uh-oh.
We got internet problems in Berkeley too. So maybe I'll just add a couple quick things and then we'll go to the next question while George reconnects. But I think both of our speakers talked about, the community's right to ask for the policing. And I think I touched on that. We will get the policing that we ask for. The only thing I would ask is that if the community wants us to redirect resources, that we give those resources the time to work. Last week, Zach talked about Richmond and the Office of Neighborhood Services and Devon Bogan. And when I met with Devon a few years ago, in the first year or two, they didn't see a lot of success, and people wanted to defund and cut that program. And yet he was able to convince them to keep it going. And ultimately, they went from 50 murders to 2. I mean, 2 is still too many, but, we don't have that issue now in Alameda where we have 50 people murdered a year. But the council members and the community had faith in that program, and they stuck to it, and it worked. So whatever we do with our budget, give it a chance to work. That's all I ask our community members. So Sarah, I don't know, Georgia, do you want to wrap real quick, like 10 seconds on that question, or should we go to the next one?
No, just I mean, it's like look into the training from your 911 responders as well. That usually is, look at the training of the first responders as well.
And John, did you get, I know John's having issues. If you wanted to chat up at that, or maybe we wait till.
Oh, yes, I'm here. No, I'm here. You able to hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, I just want to say just real quickly, you know, I was told the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again. With that being said, when we really understand police to be enforcement, meaning that's reactive, right? Something happens and then they go out to investigate. As opposed to being more proactive, looking at the root causes of what is labeled as crime and how, in a lot of ways, it would save so much money, as well as just a toll on human beings if we did redirect funding from law enforcement into programs and services. And I want to remind the folks in Alameda that in a lot of ways, essentially, that's what Prop 47 was about, right? It was understanding that incarcerating people, especially for things like drug possession, didn't, first of all, solve the disease of addiction and the amount of money spent housing people in prison, as opposed to redirecting that funding into the community. So I think that is the move, and that for me, that, and at the end of the day, I wrap up on this. You know, I really view policing as an archaic system. We do understand that the roots of policing lies in slave catching, which at that time, slaves were considered legally chattel property. And just in light of the Supreme Court ruling I shared, the same concept holds true, that police are under no obligation to protect people, but rather property. And I would add on this note, what the Supreme Court did rule as far as the responsibilities of police protecting people or those who are incarcerated. Because if you're in state prison, you're not a person. You're considered property of the state legally. I'll just end there.
Jim, this is kind of a question that goes back to the budget, and this person is asking, how do we make it happen to get mental health service professionals employed by the city for all citizens, individual nurse assigned to every school in Alameda, and an equity professional who works with the police department and AUSD to ensure that students missing school are looked into to see if they need assistance or compassion, childcare needs, etc.
I'll start first, Emily, you could jump in. I mean, nurses at the school, that's usually a school issue, and I remember my last few weeks working for Councilmember Bonta, we were in the room with the teachers negotiation, and that was one of the things the teachers union fought for, was more nurses, because that was one of the first things that's been cut. So I think our city needs to have a dialogue with our school district and see how we can partner on that. As far as you know, mental health, our budget for our mid-year budget, or mid-cycle budget, which we have a 2-year budget, the mid-cycle is on the agenda for next Tuesday. So people need to write us, they need to come to the meeting, they need to email the clerk. I know it's a little bit challenging in the COVID times, but you can email the clerk and get your voices heard. I had a discussion with the city manager about this morning on, you know, the budget is already out in a staff report, and if we wanted to make changes to it, you know, what the process would be. So that's a discussion I think we're going to have on Tuesday. And I would encourage anyone that thinks we should go in a different way than we've gone in the past to weigh in that meeting. And then also Wednesday, I think the mayor is calling a special meeting to discuss, you know, the police issue specifically. But, you know, the budget is also a critical portion of that discussion.
Yeah, and I would just add that even though the staff presentation on the budget is already put in all of the council member, and we've had our budget work sessions, nothing is final, and we certainly amend the budget throughout the year as different things occur that we need to respond to or address. We did allocate one-time money, is a small amount, to address mental health services in school last year to help bolster that, but it was one-time funds. And I think this is where, you know, yes, the school district is a separate entity, but we share constituents, and these are shared services. And while something may be taking place on a school site, or the person may be a student, you know, certainly I would hope that we can partner together to provide services as critical as mental health and health-related services. I would also just put out there again, we've traditionally had 2 school-based police officers, and I think this is part of that conversation with our campuses closed. Those officers, my understanding, have been reallocated or reassigned into new roles. But should that continue? And I think, while I think it's unfortunate that it took a viral video to get the attention of a lot of people in Alameda to start this community-wide conversation, I think that we need to turn it into an opportunity for self-reflection and to figure out what, not just take things for granted as this is how it's been in the past, but have these deeper conversations with each other about moving forward. How do we want to spend these dollars moving forward? Is this the best use of our resources? Or should we try to provide these services that we know make a difference? And how do we go about doing that? Because I think I'd love to say it's as easy as just getting a social worker or a mental health professional. We do contract out with Operation Dignity to provide outreach services with our unhoused populations. But my understanding is it's kind of bigger than that. We have to get these individuals involved with our dispatching protocol. And really, I hope this becomes a countywide conversation as well, because it's not just happening here in Alameda. And we need to think about overall dispatching and how this happens, where what our overall protocols are in shared resources countywide. But please do email us. It's on the agenda for next Tuesday, and this is a very timely conversation.
The next person says that, or go ahead.
If I can just throw in there, I mean, Eric Levitt, our city manager, did mention to me that other cities that have been having their budget hearings have had this conversation. So I'm definitely interested in, hearing what we can. I don't want to commit to anything because Malia's on the phone, and then I can't talk to anyone else about the budget. But I'm very interested in having this discussion.
The next person states that training doesn't work because you can't train out bias. So rather than training, why not defund the police and reinvest in community services that employ people who are trained to handle crisis?
I'll take a stab first at it, Malia, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So I think what we should be careful with is different words have a lot of meaning and are a bit loaded. So my friend and colleague John Knox White likes to focus on outcomes, and I totally agree that I think that's where we need to focus on outcomes. So if our outcome is that when people are having a mental health crisis or a suspected mental health crisis, that they're not responded to with the police, then that's the outcome we need to focus on. If the outcome is that the police should not be responsible for the animal shelter, that's the outcome we should focus on. So I just want to be careful about words. And, whether we like it or want to admit it or not, I mean, there's still bad actors out there. So, I mean, we still have people, that commit crimes. So I don't think that that's going to magically disappear if we suddenly decide we're going to abolish the police department or defund the police department. So when you hear the word defund, make sure you understand what that means. I mean, it doesn't mean like suddenly we're going to have $35 million at our disposal that we could spend any way we want. It means like the last question or the previous question talked about, and that's redirecting resources at the community's behest to have other people than the police do things that the community believes the police should not be doing anymore. And that's the discussion we're having at next week. That's the discussions I know they're having on the 3rd floor of City Hall. We need to take a look at everything our police do and say, is this a function of the police? Or is this a function that somebody else could do? And it puts the police out of the situation where, they could be exposed to, these type of things. I think John talked about it, proximity and such. I don't think our police should be called on homeless people. And yet we get emails almost weekly that there's a homeless encampment. Why aren't the police doing anything about it? I mean, that's a conversation we need to have as a community if that's what we want our police to do. I personally don't think it is something we want them to do. So if we're going to redirect funding there and redirect resources, we need to make sure we actually do fund those services.
But I think a couple of things. We also have them respond to code enforcement issues as opposed to having code enforcement officers or somebody from building and planning respond sometimes. But a lot of this conversation has been about responding, and I want to go back to something that George said earlier, which is let's not just be responsive, let's try to be proactive. And I think at least what I heard from that question also is rooted in how do we be proactive to prevent some of these things from becoming a problem. And that's where I think we do need to have a community-led conversation. And I think there's value in it. And I'd like to hear from our speakers about how we go about doing that, to have a community-led conversation about what are things that we're seeing as being deficiencies where a little bit of investment now could prevent bigger problems later. So how do you go about doing that? How do we go about really meeting people where they're at and getting a broad perspective? And then what would be, or is there a role for a police commission in doing that? Because I also hear what John said, which is, you know, and I wrote it down, how do you report harm to your abuser? And I think in some ways, if we're not providing services, we're allowing for people to fall through the cracks, preventative services, and then we're kind of setting them up for failure later. And so how do we have that conversation? What's been your experience around facilitating that?
So the next question is referring the video from May 23rd, and it says, why was it okay for the officers to call an elderly man dude? How will you train police to respect people of color? And I'll just add also, I think we have about 12 more questions, and I know we're running short on time, so.
I mean,
Does
I'll just say
George
those
or
are good
John?
let me add my 2 cents. I think those are good questions. I learned yesterday that our police officers are trained by Contra Costa and Alameda sheriffs. Our police chief is born and raised in Alameda and with Alameda values. So, I mean, I personally like our police officers to be trained by Alameda and not by the sheriffs of Contra Costa and Alameda County. So that's something that costs more, but I'm going to be pushing for that.
George or John, can you comment a little bit?
Well, as it relates to the training, you know, it's Alameda County and the Sheriff's Department, because of FEMA and everything else, are the recipients of most of the federal and state funds. So they do, so unfortunately, a lot of the training, and it's channeled that way. I mean, I'll give you an example. Of, a couple of years ago, a police officer trying to get to the quote unquote level of the person he was talking to, talked to a young African-American man and said to him, because they were interacting back and forth in the verbal judo, he said to him, you know, I'm trying for you not to get on my grill. And I think the police officer saw that he was talking whatever he believed it was, the language of the person he was interacting with, and using dude or whatever language that there is. I mean, or in the instance that I just described, it's disrespectful, and goes to the heart of discourtesy, which we know it's an allegation, and it's against police officers on a regular basis. So I bet you that if any individual called the police officer dude, that would escalate the reaction from the police officer. I think police officers need to be trained to be respectful. To make the answer short, no police officer should be referring to anyone in any other manner but the person's name, or in a manner which is respectful of that person. So calling somebody dude or bro or whatever they want to use, or amigo or jefe or whatever it is, ese, whatever they want to use, it is inappropriate.
This next person says they want to see inclusive recruitment of agency directors who reflect Alameda and the Bay Area. They say right now our leadership in the city are not diverse and we don't have an inclusive policy to recruit a diverse workforce and give existing staff leadership positions. What are you as council members doing to make sure inclusion happens, changing our leadership who reflect Alameda better? We don't have a Black director, a Latino Black director, a Filipino director, etc. Change is asking for inclusive leadership, having a city manager who's diverse, having middle-level manager staff that reflects the city and diversity.
So I would say that inclusivity starts at all levels. It's not just at the director's position. We lack diversity, I think, in all levels of our government, from the rank and file positions all the way on up. And I think it's very hard to talk about promotional opportunities when our overall makeup lacks diversity. I do know that certain departments are working very diligently at that. One of the anecdotes that I heard from one of our departments was that as they were going through recruits, they noticed that women, the female recruits were, and people of color were ranked lower. And so what they ended up doing was they actually interviewed them first and did reverse order, and they ended up finding that those individuals were much more prepared candidates and much more qualified. And I think this goes back to show, not even just in our recruitments, but in our standards of how we're judging candidates for various positions, taking a look at that. I do know that this council has pushed diversity and trying to be as diverse to really incentivize looking at that and promote that in our recruitments. And I think, I still think we can do better. And part of it has to do with how we're going about, like I said, judging candidates for these positions. And then who's doing the interviewing. Because if we have the same people doing the interviewing and we have the same standard of measuring candidates, we're going to continue to get candidates that are what we already have.
And just briefly, I think that's on us as council members to establish that as a goal for our direct reports. And I think if you walk into our city attorney's office, by the way, we hired the first LGBT API city attorney in our city's history, and our clerk's office, I think you'll find that those two departments are very diverse. I think it's on us to add that as our city manager's goal. But just remind people, again, once bitten, twice burned, or whatever. It's not the council to say who gets hired as a department head. I'm fully aware of that, and just make sure everyone else is aware of that. So we just have to hold our city manager accountable for making sure we have a diverse workforce. And like Malia said, if there's things that we need to do to improve on how that process plays out, then we need to make sure he does it and hold him accountable.
Here's a question for both of our guests today. In their experience in work in police oversight, how in the past has the idea of defunding come up? What is your opinion on the national conversation about defunding police departments that is happening right now?
Okay, John here, I'll go. That conversation, honestly, has been around for a while, even before there was a police commission, and I personally support it. The motto that I believe in is harm reduction. And I think a lot of that really involves how do we reimagine what public safety looks like in our community, right? So I think for me, it's not an either or. And by that, I mean, if people say, should there be a police or not a police? To me, I look at it as both and through the lens of harm reduction. How do we shrink it to a place to what Jim said earlier, because it's so crucial. Anytime conversation comes up and the few times money is attached to our alternative programs, ensuring that they have the sufficient, not just funding, but the time needed to implement it, because it's easy to fall back to the status quo, right? Well, that didn't work, so we're going to go back to the thing that we know. But at the end of the day, I'll say this, you eat an elephant the same way you eat a loaf of bread, one slice at a time.
George, I never had an elephant You can go.
Well, I look at it, defunding vis-a-vis reallocation of funds. What kind of police department do we need? What size of police department do we need? What other services that they're providing? Do we need a police department that is $180 million in the city, or 30 million, or 40 million, or $70 million in the city, when there are other critical services that we have to offer? And so redefining policing and redefining a police department within a city has to start with the definition of what those services you're looking to give, right? And whether it's response, whether respond to, or what it is that they're supposed to be doing. It's allocated that way. I mean, but I will also echo Jim's statement that there are criminal elements out there, that rape, assault still happen. That there are other deeper conversations as a social structure in America that we need to have a conversation about. Why does it create a system in which people have to steal? People have the lack of education, have opportunities. It's a much broader conversation. But as it exists right now, I mean, there is a room for a police department and for police officers in cities. We just have to make sure how we define what they're used for and how they're trained and what the expectations that we have of them.
The next person asks how we train our community to stop using police as a weapon for their white privilege, that the consequences can be life-altering, if not deadly.
That's a big trick. If I'm going to jump on this, John, the Police Department instituted an app. Innocent, right? We're going to put an app, so if you see something happening in the bar system, use the app and let us know so we can respond. But 70 to 80% of the things were against young youth of color, because whether they were too noisy or someone felt that they were behaving in a manner that affected their own personal space or their own comfortable level. So, I mean, I think that we all have to check ourselves. I think that we all have to check ourselves on a daily basis and look at what it is that how we see people and that level of proximity and connection to people. But it's really hard to train someone to get rid of their bias and their explicit, and because I'm going to use that, that implicit vis-a-vis explicit bias and how to check themselves. It's really hard to do so. I think we have to get into a point in our society in which all these differences in which people evaluate each other are non-existent, and we start taking each other for what we are, human beings.
Yes, I agree. And I would share this, because, more often than not, when I hear conversations of training, I also think it's important for folks to incorporate like that one piece of it, or maybe one half of it. Everything really comes down to what we're talking about, accountability, right? How do we disincentivize folks to stop harmful actions? And starting with the police in particular, because it seemed like they're given a blank check. So there's no real accountability if we as a society or even lawmakers are saying this act in particular is egregious, but yet they're still funded. It's a reason why folks receive tickets for minor infractions, right? The premise is, well, if I hit your pocketbook, you're going to think twice. So it's one thing to say training, but at the end of the day, like a lot of people say, you really can't legislate hearts and minds. So we have to look at this from different ways. Whether it's law enforcement, there's a way to disincentivize that behavior. One of the things I push for, or I made a request of in Oakland, is for council, for example, the amount of money spent on the federal monitor, the amount of money spent on overtime, the amount of money spent selling these police brutality lawsuits, deduct that from the budget, because they have to also bear the onus of holding themselves accountable. Now, as it relates to the community in these situations, I mean, I've heard talks of the same thing should hold true. Folks should be fined for calling the police for frivolous reasons. And I understand that's a gray area, and I'm someone who believes that, we have to think things through, what that looks like. But it's no less true. It's no less important, because at a time where unarmed Black people are being murdered, we have to look at that. Like, it's unacceptable. And just to say, well, we'll train someone. Absent of that mechanism of accountability, it opens the door for people to continue to show up as they have been.
The next person, they said their main concern with the Citizens Oversight Committee is that the police union will ultimately have the final say. Is that an issue that Oakland runs into, and especially regarding race or excessive use of force regarding accusations against officers?
Very good question. I want to share something real quick as it relates to the police union. So as I shared earlier, one of the things I fought for on the selection panel was to ensure that there were no criminal background checks. So interesting enough, the president of the OPOA had penned this real particularly nasty op-ed in which he said the idea of a convict serving on the commission is utterly distasteful. Now, we prevailed, and as it stands, no criminal background checks are conducted. Afterwards, I received word from the OPOA president through a mutual colleague that this is what he said. He misunderstood what it was I was trying to do. The point is the people hold the power. As it relates to the police union, the influence isn't so much on police commissions as they are on elected officials. And that's something that's been lifted up as well. How do we identify folks who receive money from the police? Because that goes back ultimately to the reason and the need for having a civilian-led police commission, because then money doesn't come into the picture. And ensuring that the police commission is constructed in a manner to allow it to be powerful. Last thing I will share is this. So what happened in Oakland was this, two things. First of all, the former chief was fired. Under our charter, the police commission has the power to unilaterally fire a police chief for just cause, or they can fire with, no cause, which also requires the buy-in of the mayor. That happened. The police commission also fired the 4 officers who was involved in the murder of Joshua Pollock. And of course, the police unions will always try their best to stop that, or some people might use the word undermine. The point is, it didn't happen. So the power is there. And right now, I'll wrap up on this. There's currently a move to even further strengthen the powers of the police commission.
Yeah, I just have to say really quickly, unions are there to represent the interests of their members and to make sure that their working conditions are respected and that they have the ability to collective bargaining. So I'm a supporter of unions. What I'm not a supporter is of bastardizing that process to get away from accountability and transparency and from culpability. Not the same thing. So the police officers have a right to have a union. What they don't have to right is to use that union to cover misconduct, period. Having said that, it's the city of Berkeley has to, because of politics and because the union, depending on how strong they are, they have to go to the meet and confer process. Cities define what that meet and confer process is and what it is not. At BART, it's a much different perspective. I think that we have to start with making sure that no police union in the state of California can contribute to a campaign or can endorse a campaign. And take the money and the political aspect out of that, and then we can evaluate what it is that we can kind of do and how it is measured. City councils, and if you decide to do a police oversight, whether it's by ordinance or by voter or whatever it is, you can stipulate there what the conditions are, and then you can go to a meet and confer. As long as it doesn't change the working conditions of the police officers, everything is on the books. Now you have to be careful because that's where the political arm comes in. And city councils some members start to equivocate. You have a city attorney who likes to say, well, that's part of the meet and confer. So I always recommend that there is a power, the power exists from the oversight to set the standards. You just have to set them right up front and make sure that you have robust guidelines in place. So if the union wants to argue against them, the argument is mute.
This next person is a good follow-up to that. They say, given that it's likely in Alameda that it would take a charter amendment and then a vote by the community to have a police oversight board and give that board any teeth, would it make sense to also consider how we fundamentally restructure and partially defund the police to put some of the resources we spend on police into new roles that are more suited to the types of asks we have on our police in Alameda? Perhaps an oversight board could oversee all these new roles, including the police.
I guess that's for us, Malia. That's a good suggestion. I would agree with the comment that it will take a charter change, so the voters will have to approve it. And the previous question, is another question that, I'd like, in San Francisco, the police union is like the College of Cardinals, right? You go in a nobody and you come out a county or a supervisor. Our police union, and I've told our police union head this, is pretty weak. So I don't think we have that issue in Alameda like they may have in, say, San Leandro or even Oakland. But the point's well taken. In order for any commission, if there is one, to have any credibility, it can't be a rubber stamp for union, it can't be a rubber stamp for management, and it can't be a rubber stamp for, the politicians like me and others. So, that's where the rubber hits the road in my mind, how we put people on there and, what functions we give them. So I didn't really answer the question, but I've heard the question and I appreciate it.
So, and my response is actually a question for our panelists, because you've been involved in 3 very different commissions, the BART Commission, Berkeley, and Oakland. They're all structured differently. People get appointed through different processes. There's different, parameters of oversight in terms of what's within the jurisdiction. If you could just briefly talk about that, because I think when people hear the word commission, everyone has something that they think of, but it might be different for everybody. And certainly it's been structured differently in these various cities. And so if you could talk a little bit about that, that would be helpful.
John?
Yes, I go. Everyone hear me pretty good? Okay, so make sure you're able to hear me. I will start with this. So in Oakland, our Measure LL was a charter change, a charter amendment. Mm-hmm. And here is where the problem for us began. Some of the language wasn't clearly defined, right, when we talk about a charter change in terms of who is accountable and responsible for what. The way we envisioned it, the police commission was supposed to have greater powers as opposed to how, for example, the city administrator envisioned that process. So starting there, just making sure the language is clear, especially from a legal standpoint, because we know when it comes to a matter of legality, things can be argued all day long. The second thing for us was in the manner in how police commissioners were chosen, which became the result of a compromise. The community clearly wanted that to be a community-led process, meaning allowing the selection panel, which is chosen by each council member, chooses one, the mayor gets one. The mayor in Oakland also gets to appoint 3 of the 7 police commissions. So it presented a situation to where accountability, to trust that process of accountability was at question, because many people felt the mayor did not do a good enough job of addressing the issues relating to OPD. So moving forward, there's a move now to remove the mayor's ability to select 3 of the police commissioners. And I think that's more than appropriate, because at the end of the day, when we're talking about accountability, we're also talking about how do we instill the public's trust and confidence. And it has to start with a process that's from beginning to end, not only transparent, but completely community-led. And the last thing is, I would say, as it relates to the funding, yes, by all means. I mean, for me, this is a non-negotiable. I think that cities should always invest, or in some cases, reinvest into community. And right now, at a time of the pandemic with COVID-19, I'll wrap up on this point. We know that more often than not, departments across the board always ask to slash their funding. That never happens with law enforcement. So at the end of the day, I'll leave you all with this analogy I share. To me, the way things are set up is akin to spending my paycheck on cough syrup, but then creating a GoFundMe account to purchase warm clothing. I mean, that's essentially what the county of Alameda did by giving the sheriff's department hundreds of millions of dollars, while at the same time insisting the need to levy a tax to generate affordable housing. So we can no longer segment these things. We have to understand that all these things play together. But it really starts with having, not just to understand these issues, but I'm going to be frank, it really comes down to a matter of political will.
The next question is for our council members. Have you ever substantively engaged in this fundamental question of how Alamedans want to experience public safety and policing?
I think we've started that exercise. I've certainly been thinking about it. I think what is important to me is making sure that we hear from everybody. I think that there are certainly groups that are active and are using their platforms to get to put out a position, and I respect that, and I think there's a place for that. But I also worry about the voices that we don't typically hear from, that I think are very valuable and need to be a part of this conversation, particularly communities of color, our immigrant community. I think of the different layers of privilege that exist, whether it's economic or you know, based on other things. And I think we need to find a way to hear from everybody and do that with. I think this is an inherently political process, but I want to, as much as possible, take the politics out of it and find a safe space for people to come forward and talk about this reimagined kind of use of or definition of what policing in Alameda is, and what the scope of it is, and then also have a conversation. I think that will lead to having a bigger conversation on what we touched on earlier, which is what are services that we could provide that will be preventative and could be an investment or reinvestment in our community to try to prevent having a need for a need for armed officers to respond, where we could have a mental health professional, or we could have services available such that we're not asking people to go to somebody who's armed to get help. So I think I think this is a conversation that we need to have. I think we're going to need to do it, and I think COVID obviously prevents us from having these large in-person gatherings. And so I think we need to figure out a way to actually have it, and dealing with the digital divide, understanding that certain communities, there might be language boundaries, or barriers that we need to overcome. We're going to need to get the word out in other ways. And I think facilitating this conversation, even if it's in smaller conversations that eventually get brought to the larger table. So that's, I think we're going to have that conversation as a council. But just based off of the fact that you had 4 council members listening to the community town hall on Sunday for 6 hours, myself included, Councilmember Oddie included, I think we hear you. We hear that people want to see change, and I think we're committed to finding a way to make sure that everyone's voice is included.
The next question is for John.
Can I answer that though?
Sorry. Yeah.
So first I want to say, I just thought of another thing. Our police enforce our smoking ordinance. That's something that, do you really want to send armed people out there that are trained in, to handle hostage situations and, run after, people who are robbing or murdering and to do smoking? So but Sarah, could you read that question again? Because I think it was.
Yep. So they asked, have you ever substantively engaged in this fundamental question of how Alamedans want to experience public safety and policing?
To be quite honest with you, until last week, I'll speak for myself. Given the words they used, fundamental, and no. But I think we're doing this now.
Well, I disagree with that to a little bit, to a short extent.
I answered it for myself.
No, I know. I think that, but I think there have been topics that we've looked at as a council, like, for instance, the fixed license plate readers would be one topic, or how we share data would be another topic. I think we haven't had a large scale conversation about policing in general, but I think we have thought about how do we want to be policed relative to certain aspects of policing, or what could have been expansions of policing power. I think we have had a little bit of thought brought to that, and I think this is an opportunity for us to have that broader conversation. I've certainly been thinking about it for some time, but I think that in terms of having the substantive conversation as a council, I think we're starting to have that across more than just these, beyond more than just these smaller aspects of it.
The next question is for John, and somebody has asked if you have any social media that we can follow to learn more from you.
Oh, yes, absolutely. I'm on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. My Facebook is John Arthur Jones, the third, suffix third. On Instagram is NABI_Jones, Nabi_Jones. And on Twitter is John A. Jones III. I hope that came across clear.
Loud and clear. Okay, are the council members prepared to say that to the police union that there will be significant changes which may mean fewer police officer positions?
So what I would say is, I can't speak for my colleague or my other colleagues. I certainly have had conversations about the fact that I feel like we're on the precipice of change. And certainly, you know, we're going to have that conversation about what do we need, and we always have a conversation about resources, and are we spending our resources in the best way. I don't really think that that's a conversation for us, though, to have with the police union. And I know that from, like, to Councilmember Oddie's point earlier, the police union, for instance, they're not really involved in the conversations about the number of positions or that sort of thing. They can talk about workforce changes and impacts to their unit. I think that we have to start, before we start saying we're going to cut positions, we have to figure out where we want to go. So where are we going to go, and what do we need to spend the money on? And then we have to have those value conversations of is this what we want to spend our money on, or do we want to use it in a different way? So I think to just say, look, we're going to cut positions, you did something that we don't like, we're going to cut positions, isn't the way that I approach this. I'm approaching this from, how are we defining what policing is? What are the other problems that we see that exist, and how do we want to address them? And then we allocate resources. So that's how I approach it. And, you know, and if that impacts positions, then it impacts positions. And I think that you know, as we have these conversations and we hear from the community about what our shared interests are in terms of what do we want to see addressed, that conversation will occur as part of it. But I also think that we have to change policies, for instance. And it's not just, and I want to say this because I think it's important, it's not just our policing policies, it's our dispatching policies. Because we, and this keeps getting glossed over, but there is somebody that you call to report to. And yes, there's something where we want to look at, say, is this really a reportable something, reportable incident, a reportable action? But then the person that's taking that call and how they interpret it matters, and who they dispatch matters. And we have to have that conversation too. And we really need to look at those policies in connection with all of this. Because even if we got rid of or eliminated a number of positions, if we're still dispatching the wrong people, we are going to continue to have the wrong or the answer or the outcome that we don't want to see. So I think we have room to discuss even in the short term, certain allocations and what we do with them. And we have a number of vacancies is the other thing that I would put out there. Not all departments have the vacancies that we do, which means that we could potentially provide services without necessarily cutting positions this time around. It's not to say that we wouldn't reallocate funding later.
So just to add on, I think, you know, Leah brought up that point that we do have a number of vacancies in the police department, but there might be some misconception. I mean, Alameda's not San Francisco or Oakland or Minneapolis or Chicago or even San Leandro for that matter. I mean, in the budgets that, you know, I've been faced with, and this is year 6, I've never been lobbied by the police union to do anything with positions. It's the department head. So if there's some perception that our police union here is all powerful and almighty, like I said earlier, and I said this to the union head, I think they're kind of weak and kind of impotent. So that's not a criticism, that's just my opinion. Not I'm not saying I don't want them to be that way, but you know, they pretty much are kind of like not in the room when we're making the decisions on the police force.
The next person says that the George Floyd incident was triggered by a call about an alleged crime being committed, with the response extremely out of proportion to the situation. Beyond funding different kinds of positions like have been talked about, for example, mental health, what are some of the ways that we can prevent a police response from going off the rails?
That's,
George?
no, I just spent the last 2 weeks talking about use of force policies and training and changes to use of force policy. I was on the National Association of Civilian Oversight Law Enforcement NACL call this morning, and on a call yesterday with City Council in Berkeley, and a call with the BART Police Department. I think we have to go back to de-escalation. We have to go back to training. We have to go back to CIT training, and we have to talk about use of force and what definitions of use of force and reporting.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't know the structure in Alameda, but if you don't know what many instances of use of force are being used in Alameda, how they're defined, how they're reported, how they're evaluated, you don't have an idea on how to tell someone when you respond to a call, this is how you must behave. And if you do a control hold, or you put handcuffs on, or you effect an arrest, or do a dynamic takedown, and I'm getting lost in the weeds here, how do you report that? And was that use of force not reasonable or necessary or minimal, but lawful? But lawful. I mean, so the conversation has to go when that police officer responds to that call, what kind of information they're given, what kind of training do they have, what kind of mental attitude they walk into that confrontation, what kind of biases do they have, what kind of preconceived notions do they have of what that interaction is going to be like, and when does the training trigger in for them to take a step back, de-escalate with time and distance and verbal judo, and assess the situation before they go into a use of force action. Police officers will not like continuing use of force. They would like to talk about critical incident review or critical assessment of situations, but they will never like to have a conversation about having the discretion taken away, because they want to be able to say, I can go from A to Z as fast as I can. And that's when we see the problem. We have to teach, train police officers to de-escalate. We have to train police officers what CIT training looks like, what mental health crisis looks like. And we have to hold them accountable for those standards and have them reported to the community, so the community can assess whether that use of force policy and the use of force instances are not only necessary or minimal, but also lawful.
And really quickly, George.
Questions. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, no.
So we can be precise with our answers.
Yeah, our chief had reported that we had like 33 use of force incidents last year or something like that. And I think the question of what constitutes a use of force to you, what constitutes a use of force?
See, so I mean, I would love to be able to get a hold, and I mean, if they're following California policy, I'll be more than happy to look at the Alameda Police Department use of force policy, which should be posted on their website, because it's a regulation and specific policy for the state of California. It's also transparent and accountability to have that out there. I mean, there's a huge broad conversation about whether somebody agrees to be handcuffed or searched, whether a control hold, which is as basic as just holding the arm with 2 fingers, whether that is a use of force, only being described only if there's discomfort. But if the person doesn't say there's discomfort, then it's not really cataloged as a use of force. But if I don't articulate to you that I have discomfort, then it's not a use of force. Or if the use of force, or if the discomfort is only minimal, then really it's not a use of force. So I think that defining what use of force is, what is reportable, from whether it's a control hold to a dynamic takedown or handcuffing, that's going to be critical. If the police department has 150,000 interactions a year with members of the community, and there are only 33 cases of use of force reported, I am going to be extremely doubtful that that number is correct, because then he has to know how it is reported and why it is reported. But if a police officer, in some instances, a police officer will have to report if they point a gun at a person, but not if they unholster the gun, and even if they're pointing it down. In some instances, the dynamic takedown is what's constitutes a reportable use of force, but not the handcuffing or the applying of points of pressure. So you have to be really specific. But 33 cases, I have to tell you, I could be wrong, but it sounds extremely low.
The next question is saying, if a police review board is created, would you reach out to, would you reach outside of the city of Alameda for board members in order to prevent bias?
If I just can give advice to folks here, I think that if you're having a conversation on how to create it, what are the best practices, I think you can reach out of the city of Alameda, but the city of Alameda and a police review commission must be by members of the community Alameda, because you live in that community. It is your community, is your police department. It would be a disservice to your community if you have members of that commission that are from the outside. You need to have the bias of wanting to protect your community and know your community. That's the greatest bias you can have. It's your community. You know what it's like, and you know how to define the services that you need. It would be a hard no for me.
The next person says that they know of a young black man who was arrested for resisting arrest right outside of his home. Apparently he was too loud on his phone and the police responded. They wouldn't let him go inside his house, and instead he spent 3 nights in Santa Rita and lost his job. How do we contain this amount of power, this ridiculous amount of power?
John?
Yes, I definitely speak on this. Let me say this. I think when we talk about these issues, whether it's use of force, the situation that was just named, for me, I think a lot of times what's really left out the conversation. I know we name it, but we can never forget racism is alive in America. I mean, honestly, if you think about the difference between George Floyd and Dylan Roof, what's the difference in how both were treated? I mean, we see many examples of white men, whether they're wielding knives, guns, machetes, whether they actually killing people. Guess what happened with them? They get arrested. They even get a meal from Burger King. So I think that is the reality. I think that's something that this nation, America, still has not fully come to grips with. Because race is a deep issue, and it's one that involves emotionality, it involves cognitive dissonance, and it's really uncomfortable for us to sit in that place. But if we're really going to end these situations, right, because racism plays out through every aspect that involves policing, whether it's the murder of an unarmed black person, whether it's the harassment, arresting folks. I'm someone who experienced police officers in San Francisco planting drugs on me. And how systems are also complicit. Because in that situation, in that scenario, the substance he planted on me was determined to be wax, which is not against the law. And they dropped the charges. The prosecutor refiled on me, and they came with some totally different evidence that they tested and claimed was real. So my point is, these situations play out because of white supremacy. We have to be explicit. And it's not a simple matter of saying training, right? Because it's so deeply embedded within the fabric of every institution in America. So that's why, for me, the solution really is us reimagining what public safety looks like, and not really trying to, well, let me say it this way. I'll end this note. There's 3 things, right? There's 3 steps in terms of a course of action. We can conform, meaning maintain things as they are. We can reform. We can, isolate bits and pieces of it and try to make some changes to make ourselves feel better. Or really, I like to say transform. Not just the issue, but we have to transform ourselves, our minds, how we approach it. And that takes hard work. It really does. But at the end of the day, if we want to end this, we have to go deeper. Like I say, the amount of training, I mean, that guy didn't have to have his knee on George Floyd's neck as long as he did. And in that situation, it was filmed. I can tell you that happens to countless black people that we don't even care about. So this is a real issue. I'd say, once again, the history of policing started with slave catching. That has not changed. It's not an accident. I'll give you an example. In Oakland, with the stop data that was released, 2/3 of all OPD stops were black people. And here's the kicker. Black people were least likely to emerge from an OPD stop with receiving a ticket or having any contraband on them. Conversely, it was white residents who were most likely to emerge from a traffic stop by receiving a ticket or having contraband on them. And mind you, this is at a time where 1/3 of the Black population has been lost in the city of Oakland. And the point about use of force, and I agree with George because data is tricky. One of the issues OPD have, by them being under federal oversight, they are part of the negotiated settlement agreement. They were issued 50 tasks that they had to accomplish. One involves the use of force. We now know that OPD has grossly underreported those incidents. And this is what I mean by systems does not change or reform themselves. It doesn't. You know, it's about self-interest. So we got to look at all these issues and really come up with comprehensive plans and strategies. At the end of the day, I on this note, anything less than redirecting funding to law enforcement will only serve to perpetuate the problem. We've been seeing this for far too long. And once again, I'm glad Alameda is having this conversation. Don't wait to be in a situation like Oakland, because Oakland became under federal oversight when police officers were brutalizing and planting drugs on Black residents in West Oakland, and the continued patterns of abuse, including what they call the sex scandal, on top of all these other things. At the end of the day, people are getting tired and they're fed up. And I know it sounds crass, but to me, I think money is important because I care about the lack of services in our collective communities. We have to also look at it from that standpoint. So at the end of the day, when we see people responding from a place and state of righteous anger that some people framed as looting or rioting, they don't understand. People are tired of being disenfranchised. We have to be able to look at what is it we can do to make sure we are really creating a society that's not only healthy, but when you use words like equity, when every member of that society receives fair treatment.
Okay, Malia, I don't know how we can.
I don't think we can beat that or add anything to that. I think I want to end on a just to thank both of our guests for their contributions to the conversation today. I think this is the first time I think this conversation is really being looked at seriously in Alameda, and having both of you as resources has been really helpful.
Yeah, I will echo that and say I appreciate your time and your expertise. And again, a shout out to Sarah for doing this. I think her time, she may be on overtime. And also this will be on the city's website. So those that haven't seen it and want to learn more about our discussion on civilian police commissions or boards and can listen to it. So thank you, everybody. And I look forward to continuing this conversation. We've only just begun.
Just to say, a lot of the folks are saying, giving also their extended thanks to both of you, council members, and then also to our speakers. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you all. Thanks for your time.
Okay, and thank you, council members, for having this. This is a critical step toward addressing these egregious situations that we've been witnessing. So thank you so very much.
Thanks, John.
Thanks, John. All right, with that, we'll end. Thank you all.
Bye.